We heard from the judge that he wants to get this done as quickly as possible. But is there any chance that there's going to be any sort of court appearance or trial starting before the next election?
Well, it's going to be very difficult, Alex, to pull that off. Federal cases like this generally take 1 to 2 years before they go to trial, especially a case of this complexity. However, the judge in this case is intent on pushing this case forward so that it takes place before the presidential election in November of 2024. So with a judge intent on a fast trial, she controls the courtroom. I don't rule out the possibility that there could be a trial, possibly in the spring or early summer in this case.
Now, Donald Trump has demanded the U.S. Supreme Court to intercede. Is it at all likely that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to get involved in this case?
I think that this is going to be the first of many attempts by Trump to involve the Supreme Court in this case. This application that was submitted this week to the court was very informal and very unusual. He was asking the court to change the rules regarding the televising of criminal trials in federal courts. In the United States, no cameras are allowed in federal courtrooms, much like the British system. In state courts, it's very different. Cameras are allowed in the courtroom. So he's petitioning the Supreme Court to vary that rule given the national importance of this case. It's likely that this being an informal letter request, it will just be ignored by the Supreme Court. We can, however, expect that his attorneys will probably file other appeals to the Supreme Court to stop the trial as pretrial discovery proceeds.
So do you think we might be likely to see, if this case does go to court at some point, might be likely to see cameras being allowed there?
Well, it would be a big change in the federal courts if they allowed it. These judges, the federal judges in the United States, have been very intent so far in keeping federal court proceedings kind of secret. I mean, any member of the public can go into an American courtroom and watch a trial, but there was always a fear in the federal courts that it would detract from the dignity of the court, and it would cause lawyers and witnesses to do a little bit of show lighting for television or radio if that were permitted. So I don't know. I think cameras should be allowed in the courtroom. This is such an important case. And cameras have been allowed in state courtrooms now for over 20 years without any particular problem. So we'll see what happens. I'd be surprised if the Supreme Court orders it, but you never know.
So from what I understand, prosecutors are going to push for a pre-election trial date, and Donald Trump is not likely to be required to attend this session. What could we expect to happen at the pre-election trial?
Well, this is what's going to happen in the next court appearance, which will happen in late August, is called pretrial discovery. And at that point, the case will appear before a different federal judge than the one who handled the arraignment. And that judge will lay out a detailed discovery schedule for the parties. Now, remember, this is a really complex case. He faces as much as 50 years in prison on these charges, and they involve attempts to obstruct the American election, not only in Congress, but through what we call a fake elector scheme that was used in some of the states prior to the presidential election. So there's a lot of paperwork involved, a lot of pretrial discovery, and the judge is going to try to lay out an expeditious schedule to finish that so that a trial could occur before the presidential election next year.
Paul, a lot of Donald Trump's supporters are saying, look, it's the First Amendment, freedom of speech. He can say what he wants. He hasn't broken the law. He can absolutely call into question the validity of the 2020 election. He can say exactly what he wants, and that's not breaking the law. So this idea that Donald Trump has got that First Amendment behind him and that is going to protect him, how far will that get him in the actual courtroom?
There certainly are important First Amendment rights at issue here. And of course, as a presidential candidate, he has very broad freedom of speech under the U.S. Constitution. However, there are limits on free speech. When that free speech is used as part of a criminal conspiracy to obstruct a presidential election, the First Amendment doesn't protect you in that situation. So this is a very good defense that's being put on the table by his lawyers, and the court will take a close look at it. Remember, he's not being charged with something that he said as opposed to something that he did. And what they say he did was he, through the use of a whole variety of mechanisms, tried to obstruct the presidential election and the transfer of power from himself to Joe Biden.
And finally, Paul, something that I think a lot of people, certainly in this country, are struggling to come to terms with is this idea that President Trump can continue to run for office, even if, let's say, in a magical universe, this trial proceeds very quickly and it even comes to a decision quickly. But even in a scenario where President Trump were to face a prison term, we could witness someone being elected to the White House whilst they're in prison. And the first job that they do is pardon themselves and walk out of prison straight into the White House. I mean, is that simplistic, or is that actually potentially realistic?
You know, Alex, it sounds absolutely crazy, but it could happen. The U.S. Constitution only has two requirements for somebody to serve as president of the United States. They must be 35 years old and a natural-born citizen in the United States. Now, Mr. Trump fulfills both of those requirements. And whether he's even in prison, that would not prevent him from being sworn in as president of the United States. Now, the country has never faced a situation like this in the past, although I will tell you that on the local level, this has happened. For instance, there was a mayor in Boston who actually served as the mayor of Boston from a prison cell, and he was elected while he was in prison. So this has happened on the local level. But to think of a U.S. president facing, and by the way, he's facing 3 indictments now. There's probably a 4th one coming down the pike within the next month. He's facing a staggering number of indictments and legal problems. And the idea that he could actually serve as president with all of this hanging over him is really hard to believe. But it's legal and it's possible.